The timestamp read 8 hours, 42 minutes, and 15 seconds on a quiet Saturday morning. The ocean was calm. The air smelled like salt and freedom, and a little boy named Caleb stood next to his father on the sand, holding a fishing rod, laughing at something only the two of them found funny. It was the kind of morning that felt like it was made specifically for them. No rush, no pressure, just a dad and his son stealing a few peaceful hours before the world called them back. Nobody on that beach had any idea that morning was about to be destroyed, because two men in DEA gear were already crossing the sand, walking with purpose, walking straight toward them, not because anything was wrong, not because anyone had called, but because they looked at a black man enjoying a morning with his child and decided that was reason enough. What happened next was caught on camera, every second of it. And when that footage hit the internet, it didn't just go viral. It cracked the country wide open. Because what people saw wasn't just an illegal arrest. What they saw was a little boy watching his father, a man who had served this country in the United States Navy, get handcuffed in the sand right in front of him. What they saw was a child's face in the background, confused, scared, and completely alone. That image burned itself into the conscience of an entire nation. And it cost two federal agents absolutely everything. This is that story, and every single detail deserved to be heard. If this kind of truth matters to you, hit subscribe right now, drop a like on this video, and share it so that nobody gets to look away. Dr. Julian Rhodes didn't sleep in on Saturdays. He never had. 22 years of military discipline had stolen that ability from him long ago. Back when 5 a.m. wasn't early, it was just the beginning. Back when rest was something you earned in short windows between missions, briefings, and the kind of responsibility that didn't care what day of the week it was. The Navy had built him from the inside out, sharpened his mind, straightened his spine, and given him a code he carried long after he hung up the uniform. But the Navy hadn't given him Caleb. That was the greatest thing he had ever been handed. And it hadn't come with a rank or a ribbon. It had come quietly, the way the best things always do. Caleb was 11 years old and already asking questions that made Dr. Rhodes pause before answering. Sharp kid, curious in the way that meant trouble in the best possible sense. He had his father's eyes and his mother's stubbornness, and when he laughed, which was often, the whole room shifted in his direction without knowing why. This particular Saturday had been Caleb's idea. He had been asking about fishing for weeks, tugging at the edges of his father's packed schedule with the persistence only a child can sustain. Dr. Rhodes had finally looked at his calendar, crossed out everything that could wait, and written one word in its place: Caleb. Outside of the Navy, Dr. Rhodes had built a second life that was just as formidable. He held a doctoral degree in marine biology and led a research division at a respected scientific institute, where his work on coastal ecosystems had earned him recognition at the federal level. He had consulted for 3 government agencies. His name carried weight in rooms that didn't give weight easily. None of that was on his mind that morning. That morning, he was just a father. He wore a navy blue hoodie, a baseball cap pulled low against the early breeze, and a relaxed expression of a man who had decided, at least for a few hours, to put everything down. He had loaded the car before sunrise, rods, tackle box, a cooler with sandwiches he had packed himself, and driven to the beach while Caleb dozed in the passenger seat. By the time they reached the sand, the sun was still climbing. The beach was quiet. A few early walkers moved along the shoreline, but mostly it was just open space and ocean, exactly what he had come for. He planted the rod in the wet sand and stood beside his son, watching the line disappear into the water. Caleb asked if they would catch anything big. Dr. Rhodes told him patience was the whole point. Caleb said that sounded like something a person said when they didn't know what they were doing. Dr. Rhodes laughed, loud and real, and the sound of it carried out toward the water. It was, by every measure, a perfect morning. It lasted exactly 42 minutes. They came from the parking lot side of the beach. Agent Derek Vane was in front, moving with the kind of stride that had never once questioned itself, shoulders squared, jaw set, eyes already locked on a target before his boots had even hit the sand properly. Behind him, Agent Wyatt Gentry kept pace, clipboard in hand, sunglasses catching the early morning light. They were in full DEA tactical gear on a public beach on a Saturday morning, and neither of them looked like they found that unusual. There had been no call, no tip, no report filed, no suspicious activity flagged by anyone at any point. The beach was calm. The handful of people scattered across the sand were doing what people do on beaches, walking, sitting, existing in the uncomplicated way that public spaces allow. Dr. Rhodes had his back to them. He was pointing something out to Caleb, a bird, a wave pattern, something small and fatherly, when the shadow of the two agents fell across the sand beside him. He turned around. Vane didn't offer a greeting. He didn't open with a question. He looked at Dr. Rhodes the way some men look at things they've already made a decision about, and said simply, "We need to see some ID and find out what you're doing out here." Dr. Rhodes looked at him steadily. Then he looked at Gentry. Then he looked back at Vane. "I'm fishing," he said. There was no attitude in it. No aggression. Just the plain, slightly bewildered answer of a man who could not understand why that needed explaining. He had paid taxes in this state for over 2 decades. He had bled for the flag these men wore on their sleeves. He had stood in places far more dangerous than a Florida beach and never once flinched. He was not going to flinch now. But what struck the few bystanders who were already beginning to slow down and watch wasn't Dr. Rhodes' tone. It was the contrast. A man in a hoodie holding a fishing rod with his child beside him, and 2 armed federal agents treating that image like a threat. There was no logic to it, no procedure that explained it, no version of law enforcement training that connected those dots without something else filling the gap between them. Vane asked again for ID. This time his voice had an edge to it. Caleb looked up at his father. Dr. Rhodes glanced down at his son, just for a second, and something shifted behind his eyes. Because whatever this was, whatever was about to happen, his son was watching every second of it. And that meant how he handled the next few minutes would not just be a matter of law. It would be a lesson. He drew a slow breath, and he began to speak. Dr. Rhodes didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. He spoke the way a man speaks when he knows exactly what the law says, clearly, precisely, and without apology. He told Agent Vane that he was a United States Navy veteran. He told him his name. He told him he was a Florida resident, a taxpayer, and a man who had done absolutely nothing to justify this level of attention. And then, calmly and directly, he invoked his Fourth Amendment rights, the constitutional protection against unreasonable searches and demands that exist without probable cause. He said it the way you say something you have known for a long time and never thought you would need to use standing on a beach with your child. Vane stared at him. Then Vane told him it didn't matter. Those 3 words landed like a stone dropped into still water, and the ripples moved fast. Because by now, there were people watching. A woman walking her dog had stopped completely. A couple further down the sand had turned around. 2 teenagers who had been sitting near the dunes were already holding up their phones, thumbs hovering, the instinct of their generation kicking in without a second thought. Something was happening here that didn't look right. Something that looked like it needed to be remembered. Gentry said nothing. He stood slightly behind Vane with his clipboard and his silence, which managed to be its own kind of statement. He didn't intervene. He didn't redirect. He just watched, and in watching without acting, he became as responsible for what followed as the man doing the talking. Dr. Rhodes tried again. He explained, with the patience of a man who had spent decades navigating institutions that weren't built for him, that a federal agent could not demand identification from a citizen without reasonable suspicion of a crime. He cited the amendment. He named the precedent. He was not bluffing. He knew the law the way a surgeon knows the body from years of careful, deliberate study. Vane didn't want to hear it, and Caleb, standing just a few feet away, fishing rod still in his small hands, the ocean still rolling quietly behind him, was beginning to understand that something was very wrong. His father's voice was steady, but his face had changed. There was something in it that Caleb had never quite seen before. Not fear. His father didn't scare easily, but something close to grief. The particular grief of a man realizing that the country he loved was, at this moment, refusing to love him back. The crowd was growing. The phones were up. The morning had completely transformed into something else, something tense and recorded and impossible to walk back from. Vane took a step forward, and Dr. Rhodes stood exactly where he was. It happened fast, the way injustice always does when it finally decides to stop pretending. Agent Vane moved forward and grabbed Dr. Rhodes by the wrist. Not a request, not a warning. A grip, the kind that was meant to end the conversation by force since words hadn't worked. Dr. Rhodes didn't swing, didn't pull away violently. He stood with the stillness of a man who understood that the most dangerous thing he could do in that moment was give them anything else to use against him. "You're under arrest," Vane said. "Shut up." And then the handcuffs came out. The click of them closing around the wrists of a United States Navy veteran. On a public beach, on a Saturday morning, in front of his 11-year-old son, was one of the loudest sounds anyone on that stretch of sand had ever heard. Not because it was physically loud, but because of what it meant. Because of everything it carried. The beach erupted, not in chaos, in outrage. Voices rose from every direction. The woman with the dog was yelling. The teenagers near the dunes were live streaming. The couple who had turned around earlier were now walking toward the scene with their phones raised high. And behind them more people were coming, pulled toward the commotion the way people are pulled toward things that feel historically wrong. Phrases cut through the air. "He didn't do anything. This is illegal. They can't do that." But Vane and Gentry moved as though the crowd didn't exist. Gentry finally spoke. He told everyone to back up. His voice was flat and mechanical, the voice of a man performing a role without examining it. Nobody backed up. And in the middle of all of it, in the center of the noise and the cameras and the fury of strangers who had become witnesses, stood Caleb. Small, still, holding his fishing rod with both hands like it was the only solid thing left in the world. His eyes were fixed on his father. His face wore an expression that no camera needed a filter to make devastating. It was the raw, unprocessed confusion of a child watching the adults who were supposed to protect him do something that felt catastrophically, irreversibly wrong. That image, Caleb's face in the background while his father was handcuffed in the foreground, was the frame that would end up on every news network in the country. It was the image that made people stop scrolling, that made people put down what they were doing and feel something they couldn't immediately name, but couldn't ignore either. Dr. Julian Rhodes was walked off that beach in handcuffs. Behind him, the ocean kept moving. The fishing rod Caleb had been holding eventually fell sideways into the sand. Nobody picked it up for a long time. The DEA supervisor's name was Agent Carlos Ortiz, and he arrived at the scene 17 minutes after the arrest, which in terms of career-ending timing, might as well have been 17 seconds too late. He had gotten a call in his car, a situation on the beach, two of his agents, a detainee, a crowd. The kind of call that made experienced supervisors drive faster than they probably should. By the time he stepped onto the sand and got his first look at the scene, the crowd, the phones, the recording faces, the angry voices, he already knew something had gone badly wrong. Then someone told him the name of the man in handcuffs. Ortiz went still. He asked them to repeat it. They did. Dr. Julian Rhodes, Navy veteran, 2 decades of service, federal security clearance, active consultant for agencies that Ortiz's own division had worked alongside. A man whose name appeared on federal collaboration documents that sat in filing cabinets inside buildings that Vane and Gentry had probably never set foot in. A man with institutional connections that stretched across 3 federal agencies and a professional reputation that had been built brick by careful brick over an entire lifetime of service to the very government these 2 agents represented. The expression that moved across Ortiz's face in that moment was not a simple one. It was layered, shock underneath, then the cold arithmetic of consequence, then something that looked very much like the particular dread of a man watching an avalanche that he could not stop and had not caused but was going to be buried by regardless. He walked directly to Vane. The conversation was short. It was quiet, and by the look on Vane's face during it, whatever confidence had propelled him across that beach 2 hours ago had completely abandoned him. Gentry stood a few feet away, clipboard still in hand, staring at the sand like it might offer him something. An exit, an explanation, anything. It didn't. Dr. Rhodes was released from the handcuffs within minutes. No formal charge was processed. No paperwork was completed. Just a supervisor with the ashen face of a man doing damage control on something that was already irrevocably beyond controlling. He approached Dr. Rhodes with words that the crowd strained to hear. Something about a misunderstanding, something about procedure, something that sounded very much like the beginning of an apology that could never actually be enough. Dr. Rhodes looked at him. Then he looked at Caleb, who had not moved from the spot where he had been standing. Then he looked back at Ortiz and said, quietly and with devastating clarity, that what happened on this beach was not a misunderstanding, that his son had watched every second of it, and that he intended to make sure the entire country watched it too. Behind him, at least a dozen phones were still recording. Not one of them had stopped. If you made it this far, you already know this story is bigger than one beach, one morning, or one family. This is about every person who has ever been treated like a suspect for simply existing. Share this video right now so that this story reaches every single person who needs to hear it. Hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and let's make sure Dr. Rhodes and Caleb's story is never buried or forgotten. The video didn't go viral the way most things do, slowly, then suddenly. It went viral all at once, like a match dropped into something that had been waiting a long time to burn. By noon on that same Saturday, the footage was already moving across every major platform simultaneously, shared, reposted, stitched, and quoted by millions of people who had never been to that beach and never met Dr. Julian Rhodes, but felt, watching those 2 minutes and 47 seconds of recording, that they knew exactly what they were seeing. They had seen it before, not always on camera, not always with this level of clarity, but they knew it, and that recognition, deep, personal, and exhausted, was what made the video unstoppable. The clip that hit hardest wasn't the moment of the arrest. It was the moment just before it, when Dr. Rhodes glanced down at Caleb, and Caleb looked back up at him, and for just a fraction of a second, you could see a father making a silent decision about what he was going to show his son about dignity. That half second was shared more than any other part of the footage. People posted it without captions because it didn't need one. By Sunday morning, Dr. Julian Rhodes' name was the top trending topic in the United States. News desks that had been dark for the weekend were suddenly fully lit. Anchors who had planned leisurely Sunday routines were back in front of cameras, pulling up the footage, bringing in legal analysts who used phrases like textbook Fourth Amendment violation and no defensible probable cause with the kind of quiet certainty that doesn't leave much room for the other side. There wasn't much of another side. The DEA released a brief statement, carefully worded, aggressively vague, acknowledging that the incident was under internal review. It lasted approximately 4 hours before the pressure of 40 million views made that statement feel so insufficient that it became its own part of the story. Civil rights attorneys started calling before sundown on Saturday. By Sunday evening, Dr. Rhodes' phone had received outreach from 7 of the most prominent civil rights legal teams in the country. He listened to each one. He asked questions that made each attorney on the other end of the line quietly recalibrate their assessment of who they were dealing with. This was not a man who needed the law explained to him. This was a man who needed someone to stand beside him while he used it. He chose his legal team by Monday morning. Caleb, meanwhile, had been taken to stay with family. He was quiet in the way children are quiet when they are processing something too large for words, eating normally, sleeping mostly, but retreating into himself in small ways that his family noticed and didn't push against. He had asked one question since leaving the beach. He had asked his father if the agents were going to get in trouble. Dr. Rhodes had looked at his son for a long moment before answering. Yes, he said, they are. He had not said it to comfort Caleb. He had said it because he meant it with every credential, every contact, every hard-won year of service and study and discipline he had accumulated across a lifetime. He meant it as a promise, the kind that a man only makes when he is absolutely certain he has the tools to keep it. The country was watching. The cameras were still rolling. And somewhere across town, in a DEA field office that had gone from routine to catastrophic in less than 48 hours, 2 agents were beginning to understand that their decision on that beach hadn't just been wrong. It had been the end. When federal investigators opened the complaint files on agents Derek Vane and Wyatt Gentry, they expected to find paperwork. What they found instead was an archive of failures, thick, documented, and damning in the particular way that only ignored warnings can be. The files went back 9 years. 9 years of complaints. 9 years of formal reports filed by citizens who had been stopped without cause, questioned without justification, and sent away without apology. The complaints came from different beaches, different parking lots, different stretches of public space across the same region. They came from teachers and nurses and small business owners and retirees. They came from people of different ages, different backgrounds, and varying levels of comfort with formal complaint processes. But they shared one thread so consistent that it ceased to look like coincidence approximately 3 files in. Every single complainant was black. Not most of them. Not a majority. Every one. Investigators cross-referenced the complaints against the agents' official activity logs, the stops they reported, the interactions they documented, the justifications they provided for initiating contact with members of the public. What emerged from that cross-referencing was a pattern so deliberate and so sustained that several investigators who had spent decades in federal oversight later described the file review as one of the most disturbing professional experiences of their careers. Vane had accumulated 14 formal complaints in 9 years. 11 of them had been reviewed internally, and 11 of them had been closed with no disciplinary action. The stated reasons for closure range from insufficient evidence to officer judgment deemed appropriate given field conditions, language so elastic it could justify almost anything. Gentry's file was slightly thinner but structurally identical. 8 complaints, 7 closures, 1 formal reprimand that amounted to a letter placed in a drawer. None of it had stopped them. None of it had even slowed them down. Because the system that was supposed to catch this kind of behavior had, at every critical juncture, decided not to. Supervisors who had seen the complaints had signed off on closures without meaningful review. Internal oversight processes that existed specifically to identify patterns had somehow failed to identify one that spanned nearly a decade. Whether that failure was the result of deliberate protection, bureaucratic indifference, or the institutional habit of believing agents over citizens, the outcome was the same. Vane and Gentry had been given 9 years of uninterrupted permission to operate exactly the way they had operated on that beach, until the day one of their targets happened to be a man the system couldn't quietly dismiss. Federal investigators didn't stop at the complaint files. They pulled surveillance footage from locations where prior stops had occurred. They re-interviewed complainants who had long since given up on being heard, many of whom agreed to speak again the moment they saw what had happened to Dr. Rhodes, because what had happened to him had happened to them too, just without the cameras. They tracked the paper trail of every internal review, every sign-off, every closure signature, until the accountability map stretched far beyond 2 agents on a beach and began to implicate an entire oversight structure that had chosen, repeatedly and consequentially, to look the other way. The Department of Justice opened a parallel investigation within the week. By the end of the second week, the scope of what investigators had uncovered was significant enough that it stopped being a story about 2 agents making a bad decision and became a story about a system that had made the same bad decision over and over again on behalf of those 2 agents for 9 consecutive years. The case was referred for criminal prosecution, and for the first time in 9 years, Agents Derek Vane and Wyatt Gentry ran out of people willing to close the file. The courtroom was full every single day of the trial. People lined up outside the federal courthouse before sunrise, waiting for seats in the public gallery, the way people wait for things they feel they have personally earned the right to witness. Some of them were strangers to Dr. Rhodes. Some of them were the previous complainants, the teachers, the nurses, the retirees, who had filed reports 9 years ago and been told their experiences didn't meet the threshold for action. They sat in those gallery seats with the particular stillness of people who had waited a very long time to be in the right room. The prosecution's case was, in the technical legal sense, airtight. They had the beach footage, multiple angles from multiple phones, time-stamped and authenticated, showing every moment of the encounter from approach to arrest with a clarity that left no room for reinterpretation. They had the hotel security camera footage, which captured a wider angle and showed, with devastating plainness, that there had been no disturbance, no altercation, nothing remotely suspicious about the scene before the agent arrived. They had Caleb's face in frame. They made sure the jury saw that clearly. They had the complaint files, all 9 years of them, entered into evidence in a stack that the prosecuting attorney placed on the table at the beginning of opening statements and did not move for the duration of the trial, because its physical presence alone communicated something that no argument needed to elaborate. They had the testimony of 11 previous complainants who took the stand one after another and described, in their own words, encounters that rhymed with what happened on that beach so precisely that several jurors stopped taking notes and simply listened. And they had Dr. Julian Rhodes himself. He was the final witness called by the prosecution. He took the stand in the same quiet, composed way he had conducted himself throughout. No performance, no theater, just precision. He walked the jury through the morning methodically. What he had packed for the trip, what time they had arrived, what Caleb had said that made him laugh. And then, with the same level of methodical detail, he walked them through every moment of the encounter. Every word he had spoken, every right he had cited, every second of the arrest. He did not cry. He did not raise his voice. He simply told the truth with the credibility of a man who had spent his entire life earning the right to be believed. The defense tried. They suggested that the agents had exercised reasonable field judgment, that the beach location near a known transit corridor created unique operational considerations, that the escalation had been a response to Dr. Rhodes' failure to cooperate. Each argument met the wall of the footage, the complaint files, and 11 witnesses who had never met each other and told the same story anyway, and collapsed against it. The jury deliberated for 3 hours and 51 minutes. The verdicts came back guilty on all counts: unlawful detention, civil rights violation under color of law, and filing a false incident report. The judge, in delivering the sentences, used language that was notably direct for a federal proceeding. She said that the evidence did not describe two agents making a mistake under pressure. It described two agents making a choice, repeatedly over many years, that they had been protected from answering for until now. Vane received 4 years in federal prison. Gentry received 3. They were escorted from the courtroom without their badges, without their credentials, and without the institutional protection that had followed them, silently and faithfully, for 9 years. In the gallery, someone began to clap, then someone else, then the room. The judge didn't stop it. They stood outside the courthouse on a Tuesday morning, father and son, side by side, the way they had stood on that beach 14 months earlier when the world had decided to test them. Caleb was taller now, not dramatically, the way 12-year-olds sometimes surprise you, just noticeably in a way that reminds you that time has continued moving through everything, even the hard parts. He stood close to his father with the quiet confidence of a kid who had watched his dad face something enormous and had come out the other side understanding something permanent about the kind of man his father was. The $38.7 million settlement with the Department of Justice had been finalized that morning. It was the largest wrongful arrest judgment ever pursued against the DEA in the agency's history, a number that reflected not just the harm done to one man on one morning, but the compounded weight of 9 years of institutional failure, dozens of ignored complaints, and a system that had needed for a very long time to be forced into accountability by exactly this kind of reckoning. The settlement terms were not limited to the financial figure. They included mandatory structural reforms, sweeping changes to DEA field agent oversight protocols, new requirements for complaint processing and pattern review, mandatory body camera usage in all civilian interactions, and the creation of an independent oversight board with the actual authority to act on what it found. These were not recommendations. They were binding federal conditions, attached to the judgment and subject to judicial review. They would govern how agents operated not just in one district, but nationally. Dr. Rhodes had insisted on that. His legal team had pushed for it from the beginning, because he had understood from the moment he stood on that beach with handcuffs on his wrists that a check made out to one man didn't fix anything. Reform did. Accountability did. The kind of institutional change that made it harder for the next Vane and the next Gentry to reach their 9th year without consequence. That was what the case had always been about underneath the numbers. He stepped up to the cluster of microphones outside the courthouse with Caleb beside him. Cameras rolled. Reporters leaned in. The crowd that had gathered, some of the same faces from the gallery, some of the previous complainants, some strangers who simply felt they needed to be there, went quiet. He thanked his legal team. He thanked the witnesses who had come forward. He said what he believed about justice and patience and the cost of demanding both simultaneously. And then he paused, the kind of pause that a person takes before saying the thing they have been carrying since the very beginning. He said that people kept asking him what the $38.7 million meant to him. He said the number that had stayed with him through every deposition, every hearing, every day of the trial. The number that had made it impossible for him to walk away or settle quietly or accept anything less than full accountability wasn't on any check. It was a different number entirely. It was the 42 minutes they had managed to have together on that beach before everything fell apart. 42 minutes of a fishing rod in the sand, a boy laughing at his father's jokes, and a morning that felt for a little while like the world was exactly the right size. My son was watching, he said quietly. Everything I did after that beach, I did because my son was watching. Caleb didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He just stood next to his father in the morning light, looking exactly like what he was, the whole reason it had been worth it. If this story moved you, if you felt even a fraction of what Dr. Rhodes and Caleb carried through those 14 months, then do something with that feeling right now. Share this video. Like it. Subscribe so you never miss another story that deserves to be told. These stories only travel as far as the people willing to carry them. Be one of those people. Dr. Rhodes fought so that the next Caleb watching his father wouldn't have to see what he saw. The least we can do is make sure no one looks away.